Hey everybody, well Liam is exploring one of the largest antique stores we've ever been in. I thought I'd come out here in the parking lot, hang out with you guys for a little while and answer some very specific questions that you guys had about hydrangeas. Because in my last Q&A video, I had a lot of topics covering those hydrangeas and you guys had even more very specific, very timely questions. I wanted to get those answered for you so that you can start planning for either the fall or the spring or as you need to with those hydrangeas. So these are gonna all be hydrangea questions. Number one, first question comes from, let's see, it is Susan Olivieri. She writes, I have a couple of big leaf hydrangeas that are very leggy. How do I make them more compact without cutting off all the buds? Okay, so big leaf hydrangeas are also called macrophylla hydrangeas. So those are the ones that are usually pink or blue. Sometimes they're white. They're gonna behave similarly to some of the serrata and the mountain hydrangeas as far as how they bloom, because they all bloom on old wood and some of the varieties will bloom on old and new wood. Well, with those kind of varieties, if you trim them now, you're cutting off all the ones that are blooming on old wood. So that means either your first flush of blooms for next season are going to be cut away, or you're going to be cutting off all your blooms for next season, depending on what variety is and where you're at. Because if you're in an area with a short season, you're not going to be able to have time for that plant to produce more blooms for next season. So it can be a little frustrating, and that's one of the reasons why in cold climates, macrophyllas can be a little bit of a frustration. But you have a couple options. None of them are going to be perfect, but one would be just trim it back to the shape you want, get it into that, nice, more compact way. Next year, I think you're going to see the growth is going to be really nice. It's going to be nice and bushy. You may get blooms on it next year. You may not. You're just making that sacrifice. The other option would be next spring, after it's actually not, more like summer, when it's done blooming or after it's bloomed, you're going to cut it back. And the problem with that one is that macrophylla blooms last a really long time. So once it starts blooming, it's really hard to cut them off, because even when they're done blooming and they're drying out, they still look attractive. So this is the one that's going to be the most painful for you to do, but it basically is going to be a case where once it reaches peak, wait a week or two and then do the trim then. And the flowers are going to be beautiful. You're going to hate yourself for doing it, but you'll still get to enjoy those blooms for a little while. Hey, cut them back, put them in a vase, enjoy them as long as you can. Now the third option is a bit more of a compromise, and I think this one might be the easiest for people to swallow. So right now you're going to look at your plant and you're going to look at all your leggy branches, and I would just count them out. So let's say you have 12 leggy branches on there, and then you're going to just say, okay, this fall I'm going to trim back 1/3 of the leggy branches. So I'm going to pick just 3 of them, just kind of around the plant, pull them back into about the size that I think that I would normally trim them back to, and leave all the other ones as they are. What's going to happen then is next year, those other bigger, leggier branches are still going to flower like normal. Meanwhile, the ones that you trim back, they're going to be nice and full. And sometimes what happens when you do that, those fuller branches fill in and kind of compensate for those leggier branches. So sometimes you only have to do this one time and it looks really quite decent. You're going to be quite happy with the results. If not, if those leggy branches next year are still pretty obvious, then you get to this time of year next year or early spring, then you go in, you cut another, the other third. So let's say there'd be half of the branches, leggy branches that are left, cut those back. And then you're going to have 1/3 of the original leggy branches there. And the next year you kind of look at them again and say, okay, at the end of the season, do I want to cut off this last third, or does it look good at this point? So that would be my suggestion on that one. So there's not an ideal solution, but I think the doing 1/3 and doing 1/3 and doing 1/3 is the best option, because you may, like I said, only have to do it once and you might be happy with how the shrub looks, but you never know. So that would be my way to go it. But again, there's more than one way to do this. Next question comes from Marilyn Richard, and she writes, last year I had a new panicle, and in the fall I trimmed off the flower, and this year the flower hardly was there at all. Not formed and scantily bloomed. I hesitate to trim this year because of last year's results. I'm going to be honest with you. I have a feeling that the last fall's trimming probably didn't have anything to do with your flowering for this year. And I say that because with panicle varieties, they bloom on all new growth, and they can handle a really hard prune or a really gentle prune. They pretty much come back full force no matter what. I think it was some other circumstance that caused this, and it's probably environmental. So, did you have really wet conditions? Did you have really drought conditions? Last year, a lot of people had both. Like they had a month of constant rain, and then they had 2 months of no rain at all. That plant was stressed out. Or maybe it needs some fertilizer or some compost. So think about those things. I would say, like next spring, when the snow melts, go and put some nice organic compost around that plant, all around the root line. So anywhere you think the roots will be underneath the ground there, just put a layer of that mulch, or not mulch, but compost down, and then maybe give it some time release fertilizer as well and see how it does. I think it's probably going to recover. I think it was just under stress this year. That's my take on it. Robin Wine had a couple questions. One of them, she was looking at all the branches that I cut off, and she asked, all those tall branches with blooms you cut off the panicles, could you possibly put those in soil to create new shrubs or trees, or it's not that easy? Laugh out loud. So she's basically saying, can you propagate from your cuttings that you do in the fall? I have not propagated from those cuttings in the fall, except for with arborescens. So I have found with arborescens, which are those big ball types, that like Liam would always cut them back and then he'd just lay them down and kind of use them as their own little mulch or protection. And in the spring, they were always leafing out and doing well, so then you just stick them in the ground and they did okay. Panicles, I never had that happen with, and I never tried it. Usually with panicle varieties and a lot of the other varieties, if you want to propagate them, usually you take a cutting at a different time of year when it's like a new growth cutting, and there's ways to do it. I've never done it myself, but I have seen videos on it. So yes, you can propagate from cuttings with hydrangeas. However, the ones that are in the fall after the plant's gone dormant, I haven't seen it work, but it could. I mean, I have no idea if it would work or not, but usually there's a little bit more specific way that you propagate a hydrangea from cuttings. But so that's my take on that one. Again, those arborescens though, you could do it with that, but arborescens are really easy to just divide by spading them. So when they get nice, like a big clump, you can just take the shovel and kind of break them out. I will remind you that many varieties are protected from propagation. Now, if you're propagating it for personal use, I doubt anybody's going to come after you. The propagation police are not in full force. But if you're planning to sell them, like at a nursery or greenhouse or a backyard nursery, that would be considered illegal. So just know that with certain varieties, not every variety. So check that before you do any that you're going to sell. Next question comes from Karen, and she says, I heard that pruning hydrangeas in the fall instead of spring encourages hydrangeas to bloom earlier. Is this true? This is something that I've never heard before. So from my experience, I haven't noticed ones that I cut in the fall versus in the spring blooming any differently. It seems to end up being the same, unless you're trimming them really late in the spring, like after they've leafed out and they've started to put on some growth. And if you cut them then, you may be cutting them, setting them back just a little bit, a couple weeks back, up to a month back. But in general, I don't think there's going to be a noticeable difference if there is. So I haven't actually done an experiment. I haven't actually heard anybody say this either way. So I don't have a exact answer, but I don't think you're going to notice a huge difference. And Lynn K writes, for NTCL, have you thought about the Let's Dance series? It's not a panicle, but stays low, blooms all season, and has amazing color, pink to blue depending on the soil. I have the Let's Dance Can Do around my deck, and I love them. And then Clayton Camo, sorry if I said your name wrong, mentions the Last Dance Skyview as well. And again, she wasn't looking for Macrophylla or Macrophylla serrata hybrid, but I do like the Skyview, especially Let's Dance Skyview for my colder climate. I've also had good luck with the Can Do and with the Ariba, but definitely the Skyview has had more blooms than any Macrophylla serrata hybrid that I've ever had before. So good suggestion there if you're looking at getting away from a panicle and looking at something that has more of a look of a Macrophylla or a serrata. Here's another question from Robin Wine. I have 2 Bobo hydrangea tree forms. I was wondering, should I cut the canopies back like you did on your shrub? Their branches were weak and spindly this first season, so I'm hoping to prune it in such a way that would increase the strength and thickness of my branches. Any help here would be much appreciated too. Thank you so very much. Okay, you're going to trim your hydrangea trees the same way for the most part as you would your hydrangea shrubs. In general, it's just, kind of trimming them back in a ball. You have to make that decision if you're going to leave some of the thicker branches to kind of shape out a little bit more. I find with the hydrangea trees for the first couple of years, I do usually trim them back pretty hard because I want to have a nice dense growth in there. I want a lot of branches coming out of there. Bobo automatically does that, so sometimes with Bobos, it's actually better to go in and trim back some of the thin branches. That's just something I've noticed with those, and you might get a little bit better, stronger branches from it with the Bobo specifically. A lot of the other ones, because most of the tree forms, you don't see Bobo in a tree form a whole lot, but like you see limelight trees, you'll see vanilla strawberry trees, phantom trees, and berry whites are probably the ones you see the most at in quick fires. And those are all ones that get a little bigger, and getting those bigger branches on them can be a good thing, because a lot of times the flower panicles get so big on them too that they get weighted down in the rain. So having a thicker, stronger branch can be a good thing. Choice is yours. And this is something that you can experiment with. So you could go tight for a couple of years, you could loosen it up a little, and then go back to trimming them tight if you didn't like how the results were. It does mean that, in the summer you do have to kind of live with whatever you chose in the fall or early spring, but panicle hydrangeas tend to be very forgiving, especially if you're in a cold climate, so not too big of a deal there. Now, Tiger Lynn wrote, question, is it possible to put something around that poor hydrangea tree, chicken wire or a little fence? She's talking about that poor little hydrangea tree that I had the buck attack and do the buck rub against and really scrape it and shred it and break off branches, really do a lot of damage to it. Yes, I could put something around it. I could have sprayed it with like a deer repellent. All those things would help. At this point, I'm not going to worry about it too much. I'm going to just see how it does next spring. I'm going to guess that deer's not, another buck isn't going to come through and scrape it all up again. Well, I guess they could, but I'm not going to worry about it too much. If it's not meant to be, it's not meant to be. It is a tree that wasn't supposed to be living anyway. So the fact that I've been calling it my survivor tree, if it survives this, hey, even better. Okay, so I had to change things up a little bit. Train came through, made lots of noise. Then Liam needed me in the antique store. So next day, but I'm going to continue with another question from Robin Wine. She writes, I have another question regarding my Let's Dance Ariba. For the last 2 years, I have been covering with a frost cloth, built a chicken wire enclosure, filling leaves inside the enclosure before covering it. It doesn't look like you cover yours. Will you risk killing the nice new buds that you pointed out? Because that is my fear. Maybe I'm taking all this time to cover them and I don't need to. Okay, so there is a risk that if you're not protecting them and it gets too cold, that you will lose those blooms. However, I've been very, very lucky with the Let's Dance series. So back at my parents', they are zone 5, and they have a Let's Dance Ariba and a Let's Dance Can Do, and both of those have made it through the winter, and for the most part, they've had really good first blooms, and then they also are ones that rebloom. So we've had good luck with those without any covering at all. So I would say if you're in zone 6, you're going to be just fine without doing all that extra work. The Let's Dance Skyview, which I have in zone 4, has bloomed just fine with no additional support, but that was only one winter. So we'll see if maybe we'll have a harder winter this year or next year that could affect those blooms, but for the most part, it hasn't been an issue with those particular types. With some of the other ones that are less hardy, it has been an issue where we haven't gotten any blooms. But it's going to depend on your conditions on whether or not you need to give it extra protection, because a lot of people will build that chicken wire cage, fill it full of leaves, and that does tend to do a good job of protecting those buds, but you do have to make sure and get it off in time so that you don't end up causing moisture to be in there and get your leaves all slimy and that type of thing. So it's a lot of extra work, and I really am not someone who wants to put that extra effort in to those plants. I'd rather just find plants that can handle that. So I would suggest trying not doing that this year with your Ariba and see how it does. I think it's probably going to be okay. And that brings me to another comment that I saw in a Facebook group that I had been following. And this person writes, question, I received 3 Skyview hydrangeas in 4.5-inch pots. I'm in zone 5B, 6A, northeastern Pennsylvania. Should I plant them now? The ground isn't frozen, but we do have nights below 32 degrees, so below freezing, or upsize the pots and put them in the unheated garage for the winter. Okay, so this is my suggestion on this, and there's a lot of different ways you can go. Those 4.5-inch pots are quite small, number one. So that's a little bit of a tricky thing because they could easily dry out very quickly. And if you pot them up now, the roots might not develop a lot, and you could very easily overwater them in a bigger container. So watering is going to be an issue if you keep them in that unheated garage. Also, plants in general, no matter what they are, if they're in your zone, they're probably going to do better in the ground than they are in a pot. Of course, there's risk. These are tiny plants. I'm sure whoever gave them to you must have propagated themselves, because most greenhouses, nurseries wouldn't sell those types of hydrangeas in that small of a size, especially not in the fall. So I'm guessing somebody propagated them. I'm going to say get them in the ground. You could do that technique that we mentioned before where you cover them with leaves. Definitely give them mulch. I would say cover that ground area with mulch so you're giving them some insulation. Make sure you water them in when you first do it so that way the ground isn't dry, and water the ground around the hole as well, not just where you planted them, but around it so that if the soil's dry around it, it's not sucking that water away. Again, with hydrangeas, you don't want them to be in soaking, sopping wet soil that's really muddy, but you also don't want them to dry out. So that's going to reduce the stress. So that would be my suggestion on this. There have been, most of the comments on this post say that, but there are some people who are adamant that they should keep it in their garage and that it's going to be easier and these are tender plants. Yes, but I think the conditions in your garage, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to keep favorable conditions. There's also a chance that when it warms up, your garage is going to warm up pretty fast, especially if there's a window in there, and it could break dormancy early. There's just a lot that could go wrong. If it's outside, it's going to be on your cycle, it's going to do okay. So that's my thought. It's always a risk that you might lose it though, especially when they're that small. Now, final question comes from JC Linden, and this is kind of a long one. There's a lot of little bits in this that I'm just going to comment on because I think there's some value in some of the things she says in here, and I do want us to just keep that in mind as we're watching videos. She writes, gardening is like so many things in life. People want rules and known outcomes. They want to feel they are doing the right thing. I find it amazing how certain practices get adopted and suddenly seem like absolute needs. Suppose when you're planting something, you dumped in tons of expensive organic labeled fertilizer and the plant did well. You might then think that giant dump of fertilizer was necessary every time. And so you repeat and repeat that practice. And I think what she's saying is if you're not doing control, you actually don't know if that fertilizer is helping or not helping. So without a control, you might be putting that fertilizer in and the results are going to be the same whether you put it there or not. You're never going to know. That said, I think it's perfectly normal for people to do something a certain way, and if it works, you do it that way again and again. I'm definitely that type of person. And the fact is, if something's working for you, probably don't change it. But again, don't assume that because certain people use certain fertilizers or techniques, that's the only way to do it, and that if you don't do it that way, you'll have failure. And she even goes on and says, of course, you might have simply clapped your hands 3 times when you planted that first plant that did well. Should you instantly assume your clapping is necessary? So she's basically saying, like, are you repeating every single thing that you did when you planted that plant? Because some of the things you do when you plant have no impact on it as well. She says, some plants are going to do well in many situations. It won't matter what you dump in the hole. It won't matter how many times you clap. Most gardeners with pretty flowers and gardens neither dump fertilizer in every single hole or tap their hands 3 times. If some of the practice shown in these YouTube channels were true, one would think we would have no plants growing in nature without our assistance, but of course we do. They are abundant, in fact, and that's an important point to realize that these plants want to survive and they survive in nature. Now, we do things to help accommodate them, especially if we're taking them out of their native environment. We might be putting them in soil that isn't their favorite, so we need to amend that soil or add fertilizer or compost. We might be putting them in an area that they don't get the same amount of moisture as they would in their natural habitat, so we have to add more moisture. There are a lot of things. There's also pests that may be in our environment that we have to address. So it's important to think about that, and it also, I think, basically what she's getting to is we need to just evaluate this and be okay with there being different ways of doing things. At least that's how I'm taking it, because I think it is important. Big channels influence vast numbers of people who feel they are learning facts. They are not thinking for themselves, and they do not read and gain their own background knowledge. Just because someone can say or show something in a video online does not make it fact. And I'm going to say that even when you're watching my videos, I'm just offering information based on my experience or my research. It does not mean that what I say is the end all. I have been wrong before. I have been proven that there are many different ways to do something that I say. I'm just going to tell you the way that I do it and that I have success with. And it is true, there might be things that I do that aren't necessary, but they're what I do, and that's what I share with you. But do use some critical thinking when you're doing this. Is this necessary for my environment or my situation? I'm going to agree with that. And she even says, those people who post videos are just as likely to be misinformed as anyone else about the whole range of topics. And she finishes with saying, also, I hope the lady thinking her little lime punch hydrangeas might outgrow the area under her window space. She can prune them. And I do this too. When we say prune, a lot of times we use prune and trim interchangeably. Pruning is actually a very specific practice, but I think most of us use it a little interchangeably. So that was a situation where someone thought that, I think my little lime punches are going to get bigger than I want them to in a specific area. And she's saying, hey, if you keep trimming them back, they're going to stay small. I have some thoughts in this situation. So yes, by pruning a panicle hydrangea hard every year, like way, way down, will help you keep it smaller. However, if you have a plant that, say, let's get 5 feet tall and you want to keep it at 3 feet tall, chances are a hard prune every year with those panicles, yes, it's going to keep it maybe up to a foot shorter than it normally would get, but it probably won't get it to stay exactly at that 3 feet. Now, it also depends on your conditions because, if you have a colder climate or a shorter growing season, that plant is naturally going to be a little bit smaller than one that's in maybe a warmer or longer growing season kind of area. So that's why I recommended maybe just trying it, see how big it gets. But that hard pruning, not necessarily going to keep it always shorter, and you're going to have a lot of variation depending on the conditions each year. So some years it might stay quite small, sometimes it'll get quite big. You do have the option of, let's say, in June sometime, trimming them back, and that will keep them shorter, but it also means you might have smaller flower panicles and you're going to delay the bloom by, probably a month or so. So not an ideal circumstance as well. So in general, if there's a specific height that you want your panicle hydrangeas to reach, you're better off getting a plant that naturally gets to that height. You can try the hard pruning, but you might find that the results may vary. So that's just all I'm going to say on that one. Otherwise, that's it for this video. Thank you guys for watching. Hopefully, this is some information you can use right away. I will have some more videos coming up real soon, so I'll talk to you then.